Okay, sure.
Okay, that was in Spanish. So we
I got it.
are okay. Thank you so much, Ambassador Mr. Bolton, for your time today with La Razón. We really
Sure.
appreciate it.
Very glad to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so obviously, as a former national security advisor of 3 different administrations, but also you serve as a United States ambassador to the United States. So you must have to say something about the withdrawal of the US troops in Afghanistan. What are your thoughts? Was it a right or a wrong decision?
Well, I think it was a very bad decision to make. I think that although our involvement in Afghanistan has been controversial in a number of respects, one thing is unquestionably true. During the 20 years we were there was not another terrorist attack on the United States. And I think giving up the efforts that we have made really now guarantees Taliban back in control of the country, and every prospect that they will in turn once again provide sanctuaries to terrorist groups that might contemplate further attacks on the United States or its friends around the world. So it almost turns the clock back 20 years and puts us in the position we were in before 9/11. Now that's just the consequences that flow from Afghanistan. There are many others worldwide, what Russia's reaction is, what China's reaction is to this apparent retreat by the United States. And those can have strategic implications for us as well, and increase the risk of miscalculation by governments like Russia and China.
So according to that, what could happen in a near future probably? Which are those threats or new risks that the US is exposing through this exit of Afghanistan?
Well, I think the risk, the renewed threat of terrorist attacks is real. I think terrorists all over the Middle East, really all over the world, have been greatly heartened by what they've seen, that the Taliban in exile for 20 years is now back in power. And I think that will increase their recruiting and increase their strength in a variety of countries. But it's really the bigger implications if China and Russia think that they're now free to put pressure on targets within their region in Central and Eastern Europe for Russia, in the East and South China Seas for China along the Indian border, that could increase the risk of confrontation because China and Russia try to take advantage of what they perceive as American inattention or American weakness.
So President Biden insisted, going back now to China and Russia, as you just mentioned, but before that, President Biden insisted that he just had 2 options: keeping Trump's agreement or escalating the conflict to enter into a 3rd decade of war. Do you agree with that? What else do you think that could have been done, if not any of those options?
Well, I don't think it was that choice at all. Those are both really very unacceptable choices. I think what had happened was that Trump's long negotiation with the Taliban had made the situation worse. But certainly maintaining the U.S. presence there would have signaled the Taliban that we were not going to accept any outcome where they took control of the country again. I think this is a mistake made by both Biden and Trump. I think they bear equal responsibility for it. But we actually had achieved for many years an uneasy stability in Afghanistan that prevented terrorist attacks elsewhere in the world. It's not a perfect situation, but the situation we have now with Taliban back in control is once again very threatening, very dangerous.
If you would have been the advisor of the president, what would you have recommended him?
Well, I did recommend to President Trump that he not negotiate with the Taliban and not withdraw all American forces. Obviously, that advice wasn't followed, but I would have said the same thing to Biden. We have lost a very hard-won strategic position achieved after 20 years that we've now simply walked away from. This is a self-inflicted defeat. The Taliban couldn't have done this to us. There was no substantial opposition in the United States. People may have liked or disliked our presence, but there were no demonstrations about it. There was no popular demand to leave. And Biden has just turned his back on everything that we've established there, including the important work of our NATO allies.
A few Americans are still blocked there. They cannot leave the country, and they manifested their interest to do it, as well as so many thousand Afghans who helped the United States for a long time. How that, from your experience perspective inside managing this political issue now, how something like that can be solved even when the US has not presence there anymore, at least military, probably diplomatic?
Well, it's a very bad circumstance, and I think it shows that the exit was not well planned. I think Biden, although he shares responsibility with Trump for the overall decision to leave, the way the exit itself was mismanaged and mishandled is really his responsibility. And the number of American citizens, the number of Afghans who worked with US and NATO forces who are still there and therefore at risk from the Taliban is a huge blunder on Biden's part. And it's a moral stain on the United States that we've left our own citizens and people who worked with us behind to the Taliban's mercy. Now, how we solve it, we have leverage over the Taliban. We have their foreign currency reserves in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, so that might get their attention. But you know, they don't answer to our forms of morality. They've got their own morality. The best we can hope is that they are concerned that we might actually come back in if we don't get our people out. So I think that threat needs to remain strong. We'll see what they do. The Taliban's record in complying with its agreements over a sustained period of time is very, very bad. So I think the best evidence of how dangerous the situation is the reaction of the Afghan people to Taliban taking control again. They're scared to death. And so there are a lot of Western experts who will tell us that Taliban have changed. People of Afghanistan don't believe that. And that's what worries me fundamentally.
You were mentioned before the threats, and Biden has insisted in that too. China and Russia, for example. And also, I understand new challenges, not also from the military, let's say, perspective, but also like new ways of hurting others. Like, let's mention some biological, maybe weapons, or, you know, new challenges for the future and other risks, which are not just the terrorism attacks that we have known for decades, let's say. So if we focus our attention now in the future and the new threats that is facing the United States, what would you highlight in that direction?
Well, I think the world has returned to a great power competition, but with many people able to compete, even though their capabilities don't look like traditional great power standards. That's why Iran and North Korea are threats because of their nuclear weapons programs. Others might go after biological or chemical weapons. They're sometimes called the poor man's nuclear weapon because it doesn't take as many resources to have that capability. And we've seen from the world's overall reaction to coronavirus that our defenses against biological weapons, as an example, are not very good, and that can cause substantial damage. We've got to worry about the capabilities in cyberspace. We're now so dependent on information technology and the internet that cyber warfare, which the Chinese and others are experimenting with, is a very great risk for a technologically advanced society. So, you know, as we get more advantages, and cyberspace is a good example, we also face new threats and new costs that can be imposed upon us. and we have to be constantly updating our thinking strategically.
What's the role of the United States going to be in that new context?
Well, I think the American people still support a very strong and robust American military capability and really a defense capability across the board. Just within the past 24 hours, that, for example, the House Armed Services Committee has passed a defense authorization bill, $25 billion larger than the amount the Biden administration requested. And did so on an overwhelming bipartisan basis. So even though the administration, I think, took a weaker approach than they needed to, that was rejected by Congress. I think there's going to be now a much bigger debate about national security issues. I think this month and next month, because of Afghanistan, I think it will start with what happened there and why we withdrew. But I think the debate will get bigger. And I think that's a good thing. I think we have to face up to these challenges. We can't just ignore them and hope they go away.
Something also happening in the next few days. It's the 20th anniversary, a very symbolic anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Can I ask you, do you remember what you were doing then, and how did you live that firsthand?
Well, that day I was actually planning on leaving to go to Moscow for negotiations with the Russians. And I was in a meeting at the time the first reports of the airplanes hitting the World Trade Center came in. And I left that meeting, went to my office, which was on the southeast corner of the State Department on the 7th floor. And I could see from my office window then, had not heard about it, but could see the smoke and the flames coming out of the Pentagon from the third hijacked plane. So it was obvious that this was an extraordinarily grave situation. And, we didn't know what was coming next. We didn't know whether there were more planes that might pose threats. So I didn't go to Moscow that day, that's for sure. All the airports were closed, and I stayed at the State Department through the day and through the night, trying to help stay in touch with our embassies around the world, try and understand fully what the nature of the attack was, and try to begin to think through what our response would be, which started the next day when we gave the Taliban an ultimatum that either they'd deliver al-Qaeda over to us, or we would come in and take al-Qaeda, and they would be removed from power.
What changed in the United States and in the world in general after those attacks? What changed forever?
Well, I think many people after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, thought that we had reached the end of history. That's what people were talking about in the early 1990s. There were no more threats in the world. And governments all discovered what they called a peace dividend that allowed them to reduce their military expenditures. And what happened on 9/11, I think, was that we awoke to the fact we had not reached the end of history, that the end of the Cold War didn't mean that sweetness and light had broken out around the world, that the West was still threatened by mortal enemies, and that if we failed to understand the nature of the threat, failed to take steps to protect ourselves, we could suffer again.
We saw it in so many ways, like, firsthand in airports, in airplanes, everything changed from then. And it's been keeping like that for those 20 years. Did it happen the same thing in the political, let's say, higher level? Some things changed from then forever. How could you, describe it from your national security perspective?
Well, I think this was obviously something that told us the nature of the international terrorist threat. And I don't think it's disappeared in the last 20 years. We're certainly much better able to defend ourselves. We all are. We've all taken the kinds of steps you've described in terms of air transportation. But the terrorists haven't gone away. Their ideology has not moderated. If anything, we've had the development of ISIS since then. We have competition between ISIS and Taliban now in Afghanistan, with ISIS thinking that Taliban is not hardline enough. We still have Iran, and the regime there is the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. So I think the threat remains and remains dangerous. I think, sadly, the problem is more in the United States and the West generally, that 9/11 is 20 years ago, and a lot of people don't remember it. A lot of people have forgotten what it meant. A lot of people never fully understood it, and memories fade, and the concern for the safety of our population fades with it. It's a sad lesson. Maybe this 20th anniversary will cause people to think more about it and understand that we still face threats that we have to defend against.
But very quickly, Afghanistan started because of that. And the problem you were saying is still remaining. It's not over. So it was too soon to exit Afghanistan.
Yeah, nobody likes to be involved in a long, long war. That's for sure. But if the enemy persists and continues to threaten and endanger your people, there isn't any other alternative. And it may be, again, it's a sad way to have to learn the lesson that that on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, people will realize that if you're not vigilant, the threat will return, and the danger and the destruction that can be caused will return.
Okay, so last question, Ambassador. I cannot say goodbye without asking you about Trump. Is he still the Republican leader? And more than that, do you think he still has options for running for president or even winning the presidency in 2024?
Well, I don't think he's the Republican leader anymore. My political action committee has been taking public opinion polls, and we just released one 4 or 5 weeks ago that shows Trump's support within the Republican Party continuing to decline. And I think that will go on. I think he's not the center of attention anymore. He's an ex-president. He went from sitting in the most powerful office in the world, the Oval Office, to sitting by the swimming pool at Mar-a-Lago. So his influence is diminished. I do not think he will run for president in 2024 because he's afraid of losing, and the last thing he wants to do is lose. So I think the politics of the country are actually moving in the direction of traditional conservative Republican views. We'll see whether that comes to pass in the congressional elections in 2022. But I'm actually optimistic we can elect a real conservative Republican president in 2024.
Could you say any names? If not him, who?
Well, I think we're going to have a very full field, and nobody has declared, so technically there aren't any real candidates out there. But I could name 14, 16 people who I think are already very seriously running, and I think that's a good thing. I think we should let 100 flowers bloom. Let's see who does the best job campaigning.
Okay, so thank you so much again, Ambassador Mr. Bolton. I really appreciate your time. And as I mentioned before, I will let you know when the interview is published.
Okay, well, that would be great. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much again.
Okay, thank you. Have a nice day now. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.